Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Mongabay's webinar series for journalists, broadcasting to you live from YouTube and LinkedIn. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land in the Eora Nation. This webinar is viewable on both YouTube and LinkedIn, and it will also remain on YouTube after this broadcast is over. So please do subscribe to Mongabay's YouTube channel so you can be notified when this webinar is edited and when our next one is announced. You can also get notifications about our webinar series by subscribing to Mongabay's newsletter using the subscribe button in the upper right-hand corner of the landing page at mongabay.com. All right, so today's webinar topic is how to cover wildlife corridors. And we're going to go through roughly about 10 questions today with our panelists, but I will reserve some time at the end of the webinar for audience questions as time allows. So if you think of a question, I really do encourage you to go ahead and drop it in on the chat on either LinkedIn or YouTube, and we will try to address it at the end of the panel. And just as a reminder, Mongabay is always seeking your pitches. So if you have a story idea, please send us your pitch by going to mongabay.org and click on opportunities and then pitch Mongabay a story and follow the instructions from there. But we always encourage you to pitch your story idea to other outlets if you're not going to pitch it to us. All right, I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists and we'll go straight into questions, starting with Liz Kimbrough. Liz Kimbrough is a staff writer for Mongabay. She has written about science and environmental issues since 2012, and she holds a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology from Tulane University, where she studied the microbiomes of trees. Also joining us is Arthur Middleton. Arthur is the Gertz Professor of Wildlife Management in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management at UC Berkeley. His research group studies how environmental change affects the behavioral, population, and community ecology of wide-ranging wildlife and the effectiveness of biodiversity conservation efforts. He has often collaborated with photographers, artists, filmmakers, and media organizations to communicate about science and conservation to the general public. And he has served as a senior advisor for wildlife conservation at the U.S. Department of Agriculture from 2022 to 2025, and currently co-directs the Stone Center for Environmental Stewardship at UC Berkeley. And also joining us is Prachi Thatte. Prachi is a researcher and conservationist interested in conservation beyond protected areas. Her PhD focused on understanding how wild mammals navigate through human-modified landscapes using landscape genetics approaches. Prachi worked with the Worldwide Fund for Nature, integrating research and advocacy, working collaboratively with diverse stakeholders to advance conservation planning and effective management of wildlife corridors. She coordinates the Coalition for Wildlife Corridors, which is a multi-NGO network working towards securing connected natural landscapes across India. So just to recap, we'll be giving each panelist an opportunity to address roughly 10 questions, and we'll be holding about a 15-minute session at the end of the webinar for your questions as time allows. So once again, if you think of something that you want to ask, just go ahead and drop it in the chat and I will save it for later. You'll also be able to view this entire webinar on demand on our YouTube channel within 48 hours of publication. Timestamps and any resources that are shared today will also be included in the description. If you registered, you will receive a publication notice directly to your inbox, and we will also publish a link to this webinar on the blog at mongabay.org. Okay, with that said, let's go ahead and start with our first question. So let's establish some of the basics. What are wildlife corridors? Why are they important? How and when did this concept first arise? And how widespread are they around the world? And anyone is welcome to start us off.
Hi everyone. So I guess I will go first in trying to answer what the basics about wildlife corridors. Wildlife corridors are spaces that enable movement of wildlife between habitat patches or protected areas. The concept and conversations around wildlife corridors started in mid 1900s. And a lot of times initially they were referred to as narrow linear strips of habitat connecting larger patches. They were often around verges of roads or along streams. over years, and while this still remains a popular definition of wildlife corridors, narrow strips of habitats connecting larger patches. We now know that that's just one type of corridors, and there are several different types of corridors. Some of them mosaics of different land use types that connect habitat patches. So these are some of the basics of wildlife corridors that I would begin with.
Thank you, Prachi.
Hey, Arthur here. I think Prachi, introduced the concept really well. I think there's also this sort of question of why we're talking more and more about wildlife corridors. I think it's worth noting the just extraordinary innovations in the past several decades and so people have known about the movements of life for millennia, right? And as Prachi said, more recently in the last century or more, this awareness of these sort of specific portions of landscapes, these kind of two-dimensional areas on landscapes that seem particularly important for particular creatures to use on a seasonal basis or to move between protected areas. But to get to sort of the widespread nature of corridors, we're seeing, further and further into sort of the hidden lives of animals, if you will, because of this technological revolution and animal tracking technology. And so that has been with VHF tracking, more recently with GPS tracking, and just this finer and finer scale, ability to not only kind of connect the dots between observations of animals' movements across landscapes, but get incredibly fine scale, detailed movements now by the half hour, by the minute, by the hour, the computational capabilities to analyze those data and actually get reliable, well-documented spaces on the landscape that we call corridors. And so we also, as a part of those advancements, are seeing more corridors, if you will, because we can study in greater depth, more species, more populations across more landscapes across the world. And so one might say we sort of see more corridors than we thought we were dealing with, partly too because of this revolution in technology.
Thanks for sharing, Arthur. Liz, I think you're muted.
All right. Yeah, I'll just add to that the really obvious reason for corridors is just to maintain genetic diversity and to make sure that populations aren't isolated. So just from an ecological standpoint, we want movement, so populations don't get off by themselves and turn into their own thing. So genetic diversity, also seasonal migration. And then with climate change, we're seeing species start to have what we call range shifts. So, as the climate's getting warmer, let's say on a mountain, some species are starting to migrate up into cooler places. And if we don't have, continuous habitat or at least patches of, say, forests, then there's nowhere for those species to go. So I think climate change is important. And then, speaking to the different kinds of corridors, I think there's an idea that it needs to be just an uninterrupted stream of habitat, but we're seeing, some successful projects that have used these mosaics or like stepping stones. So those are some of the other types out there.
Great, thank you all for defining that, as it were. So our next question, and you actually started to touch upon this already, is what are the main challenges for wildlife corridors, and what are the biggest sources of tension or conflict for their proponents?
Well, there's going to be a long list, but I'll I'll kick it off. I mean, I think so. I should, preface this by saying I study, in particular, I've studied large herbivores, particularly hoofed mammals in the Western United States, like elk and deer and pronghorn antelope and others, or sometimes the predators that that associate with those populations. And so my experience is kind of grounded and limited in some ways to those. But we see, I think, across a lot of these terrestrial wildlife, including the ones I study, real challenges associated with just habitat loss and its fragmentation across seasonal ranges, winter ranges, summer ranges, the corridors that connect them, from energy development, whether that's fossil fuel or renewables. We see effects of housing development and sort of urban sprawl. People can live anywhere now. They like to live closer to wild places. We're seeing a lot of those effects in the Western United States, in places wildlife like to be and like to migrate through. Reductions in quality of that habitat that is remaining. And so, the invasive grasses or encroachment of invasive shrubs or things like that, that can reduce the amount of grazing, for instance, for some of those large herbivores. In some cases, we see effects of overgrazing by domestic livestock. And then a further, aspect of habitat fragmentation, particularly to corridors themselves. So those movement paths between seasonal ranges for, say, migratory, pronghorn mule deer or species I've studied, can be roads with growing traffic volumes, where animals can be killed in some number by collisions or deterred from crossing roads because the traffic volume rises to a point that they are hesitant to move across the road because the interval between vehicles is too short. We see effects of fencing. There's 1 million miles or more of fence in the Western United States. And some of that's not bothering anybody, but a lot of it is in the way of migrating or dispersing wildlife. And so fence can cause mortality, can cause stress, and can cause other issues. And so those are a few examples from my experience of what folks are seeing and in many cases working to counter. So I'll stop there, and I'm sure others have more.
Thanks for kicking us off, Arthur.
Yeah, to add to what Arthur was saying, some of the primary threats, especially in South Asia, I guess, impacting corridors are the expanding linear infrastructure, loss and degradation of habitat, as Arthur also pointed out, and land use change. These are the major threats impacting corridors. Along with this, there's also lack of awareness in some cases that causes conflicts for people working on wildlife corridors or proponents of wildlife corridors. And just a quick example, the lack of awareness is across different stakeholders, different kinds of, across the government, among communities, and at different levels. So that often causes conflict. A quick example is of a corridor from central part of India that connects two tiger reserves, Kanha and Achanakmar tiger reserves, for those who are familiar with the region. This is a very large corridor, which is a mosaic corridor, as we had mentioned a while ago, there's patchy forests, agriculture, there are people living in the corridors, and a few roads crisscrossing through the corridors. So there are multiple stakeholders in the corridor, and often what happens is, while people living in the corridors are aware that wildlife uses areas around their villages and the forests around their villages, the term wildlife corridor is not always familiar. So a few years ago, people in a part of the corridor heard that this is going to be declared as a corridor, and thought the implication was then that villages will be relocated. And this was in a way misinformation, because the corridor has been there, the movement has been there, animals have been there. The declaration part of the corridor, India doesn't really have include corridors as a legal protection category, and we'll talk about that in a little detail later. But an area being declared and there are no provisions of, or no regulations on people being inside a corridor or not. But this sort of miscommunication and the fear and the panic that resulted, also resulted in mobilization of people marching 50 kilometers to protest against declaration of this corridors, which they thought would infringe on their rights. While there are other laws that protect rights of people living in corridors. So I guess while there are threats that are linear infrastructure expansion and land use change, there are also some challenges around lack of awareness even within the government, and the parts of the government that are involved in infrastructure development, sometimes with the communities, which affects on-ground implementation or actual conservation of corridors.
Thank you very much, Prachi. That's great insight.
Yeah, and just to add to that, when thinking about corridors, there's many different kinds, but sometimes you're protecting or maintaining a corridor that exists, and sometimes you're creating a corridor. So I've written stories about people who are have identified a corridor but are trying to restore patches of forest in between and protect what's already there. And when you look at a big strip of land like that, you have individual landowners, private landowners, you have farmers, you can have people with businesses, you can have national parks. So it's a lot of different stakeholders or entities to coordinate. There can be issues with financing, with needing to buy some of that land or convince a landowner that it's beneficial to them to allocate some of their their land to allow people to come through. And yeah, Prachi made a good point that I think because we've had a lot of these colonial models of conservation, when people hear a conservation area, they worry that they will be removed or excluded. And so I think each corridor is different and has a lot of unique challenges to navigate. But really, it seems a lot of success is about building relationships with each step along the way, like each physical place that you have to move through. And then there's scientific challenges as well. Deciding what the right width and placement and what the target species are. There's going to often you have one charismatic species like a jaguar or a tamarin monkey that has been identified that moves through and that can kind of capture funding and attention. But there's other species. So how do you prioritize and balance the needs of those multiple species? And then economic, I think you have to be conscious of the fact that people might be farming or working or living there. And so some of the best examples of corridors have leveraged that and provided economic opportunities within the corridor. So, a win-win is great.
Great. Thank you very much, everybody. We're going to move on to our next question. So what, in your opinion, are the most prominent examples of wildlife corridors around the world? Either ones that have worked really well or ones that are struggling or have clearly failed. What are some key insights and lessons that we can learn from these examples and that can be adapted to different contexts?
I can start. I wrote a story about this Brazilian Atlantic forest corridor where 6,000 hectares were rehabilitated and connected. And that project generated income for local communities through agroforestry and seed production. And it also protected the habitat of a critically endangered black lion tamarin. And so that was unique, in Brazil at the time. And so I'm looking back at my notes because it's been several years since I wrote this, but they had these strips of forest, but then they had a lot of agricultural land. And So they used the stepping stone approach, where they planted essentially tree islands to provide, steps in between the larger, contiguous pieces of forest. And there were a lot of people involved. There had been a lot of migration and settlement in the area, and it was really struggling economically. And so the program, this nonprofit, along with like state entities, were able to pay people to grow seeds, and also to make those reforestation plots have useful plants in them, like useful trees. So agroforestry, agroecology. And in the black lion tamarin, through this project, improved from being critically endangered to endangered. And then also most of these seedling nurseries were managed by women. So they really incorporated like local women, local women's leadership. And a really, really key thing, I think this is key for all conservation projects and not just corridors, is that the conservationists and nonprofits, they included local people from the very beginning in planning. They didn't come in and say, this is what we're going to do here. They came in and said, this is the vision. There's these animals we want to protect, and this ecosystem, this really vanishing ecosystem, the Brazilian Atlantic forest. And then they they collaborated with the local people so that they could have a say in how it was run, and that's why it was successful. So yeah, it was the Institute for Ecological Research, IPE, in Brazil. And they engaged settler families from Brazil's landless workers movement and local farmers in planning and implementing the corridors. They also, and the whole approach was also science driven. So they used radio collared animals, jaguars, pumas, and tamarins to first map wildlife movement and create this dream map. So they saw where these key species were moving, and then they made a map for where they wanted the forest to be, or these stepping stones to be. And they identified the first priority areas, second priority, and they worked with the people. And it's really, really successful projects. I think a really good example of how this can be done.
Thank you, Liz.
So some of the very well-known examples, I guess, of corridors that worked are the overpasses on the Trans-Canada Highway in the Banff National Park. The structures have been around. There's plenty of research and evidence that shows that these overpasses are used by wildlife. Similarly, there are structures that were built for red crabs for their annual migration in the Christmas Islands National Park. And sometimes these are popular examples, but sometimes it's easier to look at whether a corridor has worked or not if it's a man-made structure like these overpasses or underpasses and bridges. It may get slightly complicated when these are not man-made point structures or are bigger mosaic corridors. Sometimes there's indirect evidence of things having worked. And a quick example is from central India. Again, it has a network of protected areas connected by large mosaic corridors, and which there's evidence that these corridors support movement of animals. So NGOs have been doing camera trapping. There have been some research studies in this landscape, and we know there's movement. Another indirect way is also that tiger numbers in this landscape have been increasing. So Central India supports a thriving tiger population, which is estimated every 4 years. And the number of tigers, according to reports, have increased, but they've definitely not gone down. They're stable or are increasing. And this is an indirect evidence of the corridors working as well, because we had done simulations to understand what will happen if the land use changes or if the corridors don't stay the same in the future. And we found that stepping stones that Liz also mentioned, so patches of forests or habitat outside these protected areas and corridors are crucial for maintaining this increase in population. Otherwise, the numbers cannot be sustained over time, because the protected areas in this example at least are small and not big enough by themselves to maintain sustainable populations of large mammals over time. And hence this connectivity is important, and we there's evidence to show indirect, in some cases direct, that this is working. Whether it will stay the same in the future is a question. So working or not working, I guess, also depends on what point in time are we looking at it. And just a quick one more example is so if we look at any corridor, which is not a single crossing structure type of corridor, there could be multiple things that are threats in the corridor. So there could be a road passing that needs an overpass. There could be a privately owned parcel of land that needs a different approach, maybe easements, maybe incentive-based approaches, or some other things. So while we work with the stakeholders on solutions for different parts of the corridor, one gets done, things take time, something works, something else is in a different status. So I think this working, not working may not be so straightforward in larger corridors, and it's a process over time that we need to keep tracking.
My comment is not about a corridor per se, but perhaps about just broader kind of land conservation efforts that have benefited corridors, but also had their limitations. And I would just point out that the extraordinary caribou migration by the porcupine herd in Alaska is significantly protected, say, by the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, one of the biggest protected areas in North America. And so we can say that protected areas have been successful in protecting connectivity or corridors to some degree. But my point is more to say actually that even that 22 million acre protected area is not big enough to protect that migratory herd and its corridors. Or you could look at the Serengeti Mara ecosystem, smaller but still a very large set of protected areas at I'll get the numbers wrong if I try them, but several million hectares. Again, the great wildebeest, zebra, gazelle, migration complex, not fully protected by this vast protected area complex. Other approaches are needed to complement that. Where I've worked very heavily in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, not big enough. The parks in the adjacent wilderness areas are just simply not big enough. And so I think you'll hear a common refrain, I suspect, amongst us, and many folks listening already have a sense of this, that parks and protected areas, we've seen both a success that they have in partially, protecting and helping us actually keep some of these kinds of populations and corridors alive to the present, but in a sense, not failing, but really showing shortcomings, and then requiring, many of the other approaches that you're going to hear and have already heard Prachi and Liz talking about. And I think in some of the other questions, we can dig into more of the details of that.
Great. Thank you, everybody. So we sort of touched upon this earlier, but now I want to get more into the nuances of protected areas, specifically in India and the United States. And I want to ask you all, what is the policy and legal status of wildlife corridors in these two areas? And what are the different forms of policy or legal recognition in international law in your specific national or state context?
I'm happy to kick off. I mean, I'd say in the United States, it's pretty limited and piecemeal, but trending in a direction of having, quite a few sort of pilot and demonstration and different, activities that may add up to some opportunities for broader and more consistent policy. At the federal level, there's just not really much, if any, arguably federal law that focuses on terrestrial corridors or connectivity. There are some more and more sort of places within federal law that it's implicated or funded. A couple examples, certainly the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, not quite exactly what we're talking about in this conversation, but I don't want to fail to mention that we do have examples of law and policy sort of in this space that have been around a while. But in terms of terrestrial migrations, one example is of where we have a big federal law that's recent that does something significant for corridors, but isn't about corridors, was the bipartisan infrastructure law. Had about $300 million in it, passed several years ago, already in implementation, for highway crossings, in particular for migrating and dispersing wildlife. The Farm Bill, which is a huge piece of legislation, reauthorized every 5 years, doing a variety of things, including agricultural subsidies in the U.S., doesn't require that anything be done about corridors, but certainly suggests, to the agencies that administer those subsidies, those programs, that connectivity would be a good thing among a variety of things to be promoting or focusing some of those resources on. So there isn't dedicated federal law. There is no system of national, say, wildlife corridors in the United States. But there are these kind of, moments, if you will, in some of the existing legislation that are trying to think about corridors. There are at least two bills, I think, that have been floating around and introduced recently, which focus mainly on incentives and funding for corridors and connectivity. Noteworthy about those is they are, I think, wisely kind of avoiding, like, let's do a top-down, federal designation thing for corridors. They're more trying to say, let's provide flexible resources for states and local, actors to maybe be able to use, to meet some of their goals. We'll see what happens with those. But there's been some bipartisan interest in the past. I'd say there's a lot more at the state level. I'm mostly familiar in the Western U.S., but states like Wyoming, New Mexico, Colorado, to some degree California, particularly on the transportation piece, we might say there's a bit of a laboratory of the states approach going on with different policies at the legislative or executive level in the states. And so there's been some progress there. Many people are familiar with the Endangered Species Act in the United States as, our most potent biodiversity law. But it's really focused on preventing scarcity and extinction. And often when we're talking about, not always, but often when we're talking about corridors and connectivity, we're actually trying to maintain and promote abundance. And so ironically, our Endangered Species Act really doesn't offer a whole lot when it comes to corridors and connectivity. And this is a problem because many endangered species, take a grizzly bear, or sensitive species like the wolf, need abundant connected populations of, say, migrating hoofed mammals in order to thrive. And so we've got law about the sort of that focal species, but not right now about the underlying prey populations that need to stay connected. And so I'd say that the U.S. is sort of doing a bunch of experiments and demonstrations and trending towards more of a consistent approach to corridors, but does not have that and is moving slower than the sort of rate at which we're losing habitat and losing corridors in developing a policy.
Yeah, so for India, India doesn't have standalone or explicit legislation for wildlife corridors or connectivity like Bhutan or Costa Rica do. But there are legal provisions, regulatory frameworks, policies that talk about corridors. So while, like I said, corridors are not a protection category under law in India, there are some other protection categories like eco-sensitive zones, community reserves that can be used for conserving corridors, for conserving a space that animals use. There are also legal sanctions for tiger corridors through the Wildlife Protection Act. So these legal sanctions don't exist for all other wildlife species or many other wildlife species. However, there's a lot of jurisprudence. The Wildlife Protection Act does recognize that wildlife should move between protected areas, and these connectivity spaces are important. So that sort of lends itself to talking about corridors in the legal space. And there is jurisprudence around corridors in India where permanent structures were demolished because a certain area was elephant corridor, and such judicial orders then accumulate because India has both case law and legislation that the legal system uses. So any kind of jurisprudence, previous judgments on anything to do with corridors accumulates and then adds on and provides legal tools for corridor conservation. So that's a very quick background of the legal status of corridors in India. In policy, there are several policy documents that talk about corridors. India has a National Wildlife Action Plan, which is made not very frequently, but for a longer duration, that explicitly talks about wildlife corridors. It's not a legally binding document, but again, the judicial system considers it as a guiding document for planning wildlife areas. So then it's an indirect way of how it influences the legal system. India is also signatory to CMS and a couple of other international treaties that talk about not just protected areas, but also importance of connectivity. Again, not legally binding, but there are commitments and policies that somehow support corridors and their protection.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to what Arthur said about the US, but I am, and I know you didn't ask about Brazil, but I am thinking about the example that I gave. And in Brazil, there's a forest code that requires landowners to maintain riparian corridors in some areas. And so one of the things that made that project with the lion tamarins successful is that landowners and farmers were required to maintain riparian zones. And so they took advantage that the NGO that was working on this took advantage of that and said, hey, you're a landowner, you have to maintain forests, so why not make this forest usable for wildlife and income generating, and we'll give you the seedlings that are being grown in our nurseries over here. So yeah, I think it's there are opportunities like that to use some of these codes to obviously to create these corridors.
Thank you, everyone. Our next question also asks about law and policy. So maybe perhaps this is a good time to sort of examine what kinds of questions and lines of inquiry journalists should be examining. So my question is, where and how are wildlife corridors being integrated or considered in both law and local land use policy? And I know that you all just listed some. And conversely, where is there resistance to doing so? And when journalists are reporting at the local and subnational level, what are some key questions and issues they should be looking into?
Well, I think that I can try and draw from my just local experience in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, where we've been surprised to just find when we look across some of the corridors that have been well documented recently, maybe only about half of the counties, and there's about 28 counties in that ecosystem, actually have any zoning or local regulation that would limit the density of housing that could be built within some of the seasonal ranges of those key wildlife. And when you get into those conversations, you can actually quickly begin to understand some of the concerns of those more resistant local governments, where they've got agricultural producers that perhaps are sort of what you might call land rich but cash poor. They have land, but they have otherwise limited resources. And so there's a reluctance to impose a regulation that would take away some of the only wealth or that those folks have. And so I guess I offer that just as a little insight into why we would not see that kind of, regulation in some of those places. And so where that's left us in large swaths of that landscape is recognizing we really have to be able to build a good incentive-based kind of voluntary approach that doesn't move as slowly as those approaches, often do. And that's one of the key challenges that we're sort of grappling with in that landscape. And we could use other examples at sort of other levels, but I just use that one from that county level. I think as journalists ask, questions, I think that was another part of this question that journalists should look into. I just think it's really important to try and understand where that resistance is coming from, to kind of engage at that community level and trying to understand that folks might have some land uses or be doing some activities that are compatible perhaps with the wildlife, that they're, for reasons Prachi kind of touched on earlier, skeptical about because of histories of kind of what they perceive as land grabs that want to shut down, what some of those agricultural land uses or maybe low density development that might be quite compatible with wildlife, maybe above some threshold they're not, but to kind of engage and try to understand those and have good, sources that can help, provide insight as to what some of that resistance is. And this may not be quite exactly what the question is talking about, but I just, one of the things I've thought about a lot over the course of some of these questions is right now, I'd say that we're talking, and I say we, kind of the community in general, talks about corridors and the solutions in a bit of a piecemeal way. So some jurisdictions or communities or NGOs or professors or whatever have their favorite, it's about wildlife crossings, or others are talking about land protections, or some places there's a successful fence initiative. And so I want to kind of encourage journalists to think about, trying to ask questions that tie these together, because inevitably most of these corridors need multiple, interventions happening kind of all at once in a coordinated way. And I think we're too often singling one out because it's exciting or it's new. But if we build a wildlife crossing and then we destroy the habitat on either side of the road, it doesn't really matter that we built the wildlife crossing. And we could come up with lots of other ways to illustrate that point. But I've been thinking a lot about kind of the next era of talking about corridors is really trying to tie these together and probe these stories in a way that looks across, the whole set of habitats that we need to be talking about.
Yeah, those are good points. I was thinking about some questions for journalists. I think asking like what legal instruments actually protect these corridors locally, and how are corridors enforced when violated, if there is a legal framework around it, because sometimes it is just agreements with landowners. So how is this actually going to be implemented and enforced over time, and who bears the cost versus the benefits of this implementation? Are there compensation mechanisms for like affected landowners? Also, what monitoring is happening to prove that the corridor is actually working? Those are just some things that came to mind. And I think you asked about places where this is happening well. I mean, Costa Rica, we know, is a great example. Prachi mentioned earlier, their biological corridors are legally recognized in land use planning. I think Australia's state of Victoria includes corridors in like regional planning schemes. Resistance, obviously, anywhere where it's rapidly developing and economic growth is being prioritized. That's across the board with environmental issues. That's where you're going to have resistance, and that's a lot of places. And in the States, that can vary. That varies state by state, region by region, as it does everywhere. And yeah, I think Prachi, you also mentioned Bhutan. I don't know much about that, so I don't know if you wanted to talk a little bit about that. I'm curious.
Sure, yeah. So Bhutan does have a network of wildlife corridors that is recognized and protected legally, connecting the different protected areas. And these are slightly larger areas, sometimes multi-use areas that come under wildlife corridors. Coming back to the question, I think some of the ways in which these corridor concerns are being integrated through policy in specifically in India are the policy or guiding acknowledgement by other government stakeholders. So one example is the Ministry of Roads in 2019 had issued, so since 2001, there have been several government orders around corridors and connectivity and infrastructure development. In 2019, there was a notification or circular issued saying that all the roads passing through protected areas and wildlife corridors need to have mitigation measures when they are expanded or newly constructed. India already has the second largest road network in the world. So largely, it's not new roads, but expansion of older roads that take place. So while everyone knows about protected areas, and very often when a road is expanded through a protected areas, mitigation structures may be or usually are incorporated, it's not the same for corridors. There's no systematic study looking at how many corridors have mitigation measures, when were they expanded with respect to the policies and the government orders, etc. But that's one thing that needs investigation. We know through anecdotal evidence, just by observations, that corridors don't have as many mitigation structures, despite the fact that there are policies supporting presence of or incorporation of these structures. What needs investigation is, why is that the case? Sort of echoing Arthur's point of understanding what are the barriers to this, incorporation of corridor concerns in different policies. Say non-traditional partners, not just the forest department of a state or nation, but say infrastructure development agencies. Is there lack of awareness? Is there lack of intent? Is there technology that's not available or accessible, or such things? So despite provisions, why is action not always there, is one, I think, avenue for investigation, especially for journalists, and also, I guess, otherwise for people working on policy and effective implementation of policies. And other than this, I think generally, when corridor concerns don't get incorporated in other sectors, it's also that the management and action often is being driven by policies of those sectors. Say it could be agriculture, it could be rural development, it could be infrastructure, and those policies are not in sync. So looking at policies of other sectors that could be conflicting is another way of looking into the congruence or the lack of considerations in some cases of ecological corridors and other sectors.
Thank you, Prachi. Does anyone have anything to add before we move on? Alrighty, so we've gone over a few like oppositions to wildlife corridors here. They may not only face resistance from economic and industrial interests, but they potentially from different levels of government, different communities and individuals if their rights are not respected. So, how do proponents of wildlife corridors navigate tensions and conflicts between different interests and legal frameworks, such as local landowners, state land, and protected areas?
Well, it's a great and it's a really important question. I think, and I'll speak from my experience mainly in the Western U.S., which I don't necessarily think characterizes other places, but I think there's a long history in that region of sort of talking about corridors in sort of a vague, an overly vague way, or mapping them in an overly vague way, partly because that was the state of the tools and the capabilities for a long time. Also, a little bit more problematically, sort of then instrumentalizing corridors as a compelling, way to get more land set aside as wilderness or as protected land, particularly on public lands. And fortunately, I think now we have the data, kind of the knowledge, some of the specific practices that we know we need to do to kind of guide a more careful and targeted or dialogue, if you will, about what the corridor is and what some of the interventions might need to be to ensure that it's protected. I think folks, that are increasingly getting very informed and serious about, like, how to do this, or in your word, Mike, how to navigate these tensions, are really, going and listening to states who feel that they might be closer to, the public, in their state and its interests and the potential solutions, are listening closely to tribes, are listening closely to landowners, are having a lot of conversations, are then, tailoring, the design and the interventions based on those, kinds of conversations. And so, to give an example from my experience, like, I did a lot of that when I was working in the Biden administration out in the state of Wyoming. And you get to places that you don't expect, like, okay, we want to do corridors. I went and listened for months, and it turns out the first priority folks have is about this weed, that is invasive and is affecting the, grazing conditions on the landscape and is also bad for wildlife. I really need to go help solve this problem and find resources to help solve this problem first, and then we're going to work our way towards some of the private land protection tools and some of the fencing, issues that we also think are important. And so the point just being, I think navigating this is about a lot of listening and then crafting some solutions around what is being heard close to the ground.
Thank you, Arthur.
Yeah, so I think engaging stakeholders, multi-stakeholder engagement, and sort of participatory planning is at the core of it. Of course, easier said than done, because these are different stakeholders with very different objectives very often. And there are a few challenges. Some of them are sort of conflicting mandates, but also just the understanding of corridor as space, I think, because in some cases they have very clear boundaries. If there's a stark gradient in terms of urbanized area versus natural habitat patch, when the gradient when there's a gradient, it's very difficult to put bounds on where the corridor ends. It's often very diffuse. So also realizing that this is not a very well defined geographical space. Sometimes can be an initial sort of not really conflict, but just an issue to discuss. Finding out what the conflicts are and having a conversation together with the different stakeholders in order to address them is a starting point. Also, finding congruence in the different mandates or schemes. Just a quick example, perhaps a digression, but now that I've started, a quick example is in India, the Agriculture Department offers crop insurance. When there are extreme climate events, there's crop insurance that the farmers can opt for and get their crop insured. But this crop insurance for a long time did not consider wildlife conflict as a extreme. Of course, it's not an extreme weather event, but that was not covered under crop insurance. While in a lot of corridors that are mosaics or areas around corridors, there is crop depredation by wildlife that lives in corridors or passes through corridors. And that's why investigating where these congruences lie, or what are the areas where we can have schemes that are sort of in sync with each other is an important area. And now a few states in India do include wildlife conflict in the crop insurance scheme of the government. Its implementation, of course, it's new, so that's another issue. But looking at stakeholder engagement, finding common ground is one important way.
Thank you, Prachi.
Yeah, I think you've pretty well covered things. I think, when you make those agreements, creating like flexible arrangement, flexible conservation easements rather than outright acquisition is a good strategy. Obviously, we said over and over that communities, everyone needs to be involved from the beginning. Focusing on these like win-win, opportunities. Obviously, if the landowners can benefit, voluntary participation, of course. Yeah, but I don't have much. Yeah, I think you covered it pretty well.
Great, thank you all. We may not get to all the questions we have today, but there's at least two more really important ones that I want to touch upon. So the next one, you've somewhat alluded to this, throughout many of your answers, but it's important to address it directly. What should journalists consider when they're looking into a wildlife corridor's potential or actual impacts on human rights, especially for indigenous peoples or for local people with limited recognized rights? Examples could be certain ethnic minorities or people who have been displaced by other projects.
A quick, I guess, answer from my side is looking into any restrictions on access and land ownership are the top things, I guess, to consider while looking at whether the rights are recognized and if access is not compensated when an area is a wildlife corridor. So just trying to understand what are the different strategies and what is getting impacted would be a good point to start.
Great, thank you, Prachi.
Yeah, I think making sure Indigenous people were involved in planning and through free, prior, and informed consent is always a big question. Like Prachi said, like our traditional land uses and access rights maintained. Are benefits equitably shared? Is this extractive, or are the benefits going to be shared with local communities? And then questions about decision making and governance. So while it's really great to include people in the planning, will people continue to be included in decision making in how these areas are, how things are governed? Traditional ecological knowledge is also, is there any incorporation of that? Are the people who live there getting to guide guide the project with what they know about the place that they live and often have been for, since time immemorial. And if the compensation schemes are actually reaching, some of the most affected community members, or just how equitable the sharing of these benefits are, I think are all important considerations for journalists looking into these types of projects.
Yeah, I agree. I would say, just asking this question, each time is important. I think, I've just appreciated like editors that that assign folks, maybe whether we're the national publication, but they're signing someone, with regional or local knowledge who maybe already has sources or, knows how to ask and answer this kind of question. Ways of cultivating folks at that local level to be part of the story, to guard against, these kinds of problems that can arise, from what you're asking about. But I think also, sometimes I've found, particularly with and this isn't so much about Indigenous, well, it is about Indigenous folks as well as kind of maybe local agricultural producers, just recognizing some of those folks as having knowledge and maybe having been part of stewarding this thing. Because often these stories, particularly if there's a new set of maps or a new scientific breakthrough, sort of tend to act as if this is a new discovery. And it might not be a new discovery, it might just be a new and more detailed or comprehensive way of knowing about the thing that about which there's been some knowledge and stewardship for a long time previously. And well, it's not so much about the journalism, it's more about the conservation practice. I have found often in engagement with private landowners that I'm sort of jumping all the way to the part about what financial tools are needed or payments or incentives. Some of them will just say I just need some recognition. That's actually one of the incentives, to be a part of this. And so I'll leave it at that.
Great answers, everyone. The next question I have is also very important. So depending on the context, it appears that some wildlife corridors are encroached upon by human infrastructure, where others seek to adapt to it, or perhaps they're trying to remedy ecological degradation, with the restoration or reforestation schemes. So how common are each of these situations, and what are some examples that stand out to you in either case?
Well, one thing that just came to mind, I hadn't really thought about this as being a major corridor connectivity, is, recently in California, on the Klamath River, there was a dam removal. So there's the removal of 4 major dams and restored, 400 miles of connectivity for salmon and other fish species. So that's a really incredible example. That was a 30-year movement led by the tribes to restore a river. That's pretty shining example. And I hadn't really thought until now about the dam removal and restoring these waterways it's corridor, so it's a water corridor.
I would say, Mike, I'm not sure I know how common each of these is globally, just by virtue of not knowing, every case or even most of them around the world. But I'd say I can sort of see aspects of each of these approaches even at the population level or at the landscape level within some of the areas that I've worked. And so in many of these cases, there's a recognition that we've already lost, some of this population's habitat, maybe some part of the migration or some segment of the herds that were already in a human impacted situation, trying to spare maybe what's left or restore it. Maybe parts of the corridor, folks are trying to protect land by acquiring it and putting it in a protected area, or do it using a conservation easement on private land. Maybe in other parts, they're working on maybe we're going to allow some oil and gas, drilling, but can we limit the density or include some way that the most disruptive activity is a noise and such is seasonally limited, or using technologies to limit the impact of that. In other parts of the corridor, it might be we got to do this invasive species treatment and beat back encroaching conifers to maintain a grassland and restore the portion of this migration. And so my point is just almost that we can see many of these approaches, even sometimes in the same, herd that I've worked on or landscape that we're working in.
I'd say the risk of land use change and corridors becoming non-functional due to anthropogenic developmental activities is quite widespread and high in countries that are developing rapidly. Because of obvious reasons of development, infrastructure, and pressure on land associated with economic development usually. So these kinds of risks to corridors are widespread in developing countries. Restoration is also seen in a case-by-case basis where it's required in different places. Again, in areas or in countries that have high pressure on land, and I'm also thinking of large populations in South Asia, which is home to 25% of the global of humanity. So pressure on land, setting aside large parcels of land for restoration for wildlife corridors may not always be possible, and may not be as common as the risk that is there of corridors becoming non-functional due to development.
Great. Thank you very much, Prachi. Does anyone have anything to add before we move on to the very last question?
Just often that, protection is much more effective than restoration. So that's something to consider in these approaches.
Great. So to summarize everything we've talked about so far, what are the biggest questions and opportunities for wildlife corridors in the years ahead? And also, which organizations, individuals, or resources have you found particularly helpful in your own understanding of corridors and would recommend to journalists? So it's kind of a two-parter question there.
I personally think there's a lot of opportunity. Sometimes I've got to sort of fight to stay optimistic because in some of the places I work, we're seeing a lot of, habitat, loss, but we're also seeing, a much greater awareness and in some cases public excitement and kind of broader stakeholder kind of awareness of what we're talking about here, which sets the stage for maybe picking up the pace and scale of action. I think one of the biggest needs and also opportunities is in this. I think you've heard it through a lot of these questions, but talking about a much more community engaged, incentive kind of forward, incentive based approach. That's not to say let's not have regulatory or other kinds of approaches, but how to have a really balanced approach that's bringing recognition, rewards, supports, incentives, to folks. So I think that's where a lot of the need, the opportunity, and some of the most interesting stories are because it's about like people, getting their hands dirty and doing stuff on the ground together, to pull down fences or protect a ranch or restore habitat together. And so as far as organizations, in the course of my work in government, I just had the benefit of getting to know a lot of organizations engaged on this work. And in the United States, I'm really excited about the work of many of the local and regional land trusts that are starting to prioritize corridors and connectivity in their work, working with private landowners to protect land. Many of the regional and local conservation organizations that are really embedded into communities and have a consistent presence and are, because this work is going to be relational, and so I just saw a lot of promise at that kind of regional and local scale with those kinds of organizations.
Thank you, Arthur.
One of the big questions I think in the future is how do we balance and synergize the seemingly disparate goals of economic development and wildlife connectivity conservation. How are we able to do that in the future will determine to some extent the status of corridors and if we are able to secure them going into the future. Along with that, I think there are several opportunities. Some of them Martha has already mentioned, but also working towards multi-stakeholder management of corridors, working with communities living in corridors on co-management of these corridors. How do we really make it participatory in going forward? Is I think a great opportunity. A lot of work has been happening around these things in different places. Some successes, some still struggles. I think because we're still figuring out how do we work this out. But I think that's a very good opportunity because going forward. So yeah, those are two things from my side.
Yeah, I agree, and I think some of the things that excite me as a journalist. Yeah, Arthur, you make a good point that some of the best parts of these stories are the people on the ground that are making this happen. The Brazil story was great because there was this network of women running seedling nurseries. These like really incredible women that were starting these businesses and growing trees and making a living and also regrowing the forest, and getting to talk to them individually was really interesting. It's also interesting, advances in monitoring, wildlife monitoring, and having sometimes your charismatic character in your story is wildlife, or it's a particular collared animal, and so that's really interesting as a journalist. I also think increasingly looking to indigenous-led conservation initiatives. In the United States, for example, colonizers had this idea that they came in the West, let's say the West, like California, that they came into this pristine wilderness, but it wasn't a pristine wilderness. It was a wilderness that had been managed by indigenous people for millennia. And, again, thinking about the salmon, the Klamath River and the salmon, there were these salmon ceremonies that happened all along the river. There's several tribes, and even when the tribes were fighting, I heard this from an elder. Even when the tribes were at odds and fighting, they would pause and have these salmon ceremonies that were coordinated one after another. And they say that the doing these controlled burns, which was part of the salmon ceremony, signaled the salmon that it was time to migrate. So there's all kinds of deep, indigenous knowledge, and it's really interesting to just kind of take the lead of people who've been there for a long time. Those stories are fascinating to me as a journalist.
All right, everyone. Thank you for that. I think we do have time to pick up an audience question that came in. And it's kind of a callback to something that Arthur was talking about at the beginning in terms of national parks. But this individual says, "Hello from Colombia. Do you think national parks get more media attention than non-declared but ecologically important areas?
Yes. Yes, 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 yes. It's a big challenge. I I just 1,000 times yes. I mean, just recently we had the extraordinary wonderful achievement of 600 acres of land owned by the state of Wyoming being bought and incorporated into Grand Teton National Park. But I was a little bit saddened that that is all over the national and even international news, when it's very hard to get attention to anything that's going on sort of the private rangelands across hundreds of thousands of millions and millions of acres in the same landscape, including I found that when I was working in the U.S. Department of Agriculture, when we did tens of thousands of acres of land protections with agricultural producers, or hundreds of thousands of acres of habitat restoration, that really wasn't something that was of much interest to journalists. I mean, I'm just going to be frank about it. They were interested in what's much more interested in sort of the protected areas and the wilderness based kinds of stories, or the regulatory things that had a fight associated with them. And so I just think it's a really good question, and it's a really big issue. And I implore those of you who have some tools at your disposal to build up the other, the story of those other lands that actually, look, in the United States, it was lands with the best soil, the most grass, the water, the timber, that were privatized and settled. In that fraught history, as a consequence of that, our parks and protected areas are not particularly rich in biodiversity, with really important exceptions. Our public lands are less rich in biodiversity than these other lands. That we need to build up that story and that infrastructure, financial, human policy on the other side of that coin. So thank you for that question. It's near and dear to me, and for sure.
Does anyone have anything to add to that? No. And well, I think that is everything we have time for, because we've almost eclipsed about 80 minutes, and we've been, our panelists have been very generous with their time. So I just want to say thank you, all of you, for joining us to speak with us about wildlife corridors and providing a really insightful discussion. I know this is a huge topic, and we got three very specific perspectives here. So do look into it. Mongabay does regularly cover wildlife corridors. I just want to note that if you missed any of this webinar, or you joined halfway in, or what have you, it will be published on YouTube after it's done. And then about 24 to 48 hours from now, I will update it with resources and timestamps. And you'll also receive a link to this video if you registered for this webinar. So you'll be notified there as well. Again, if you want to follow along with any of our webinar series, I encourage you to subscribe to our webinar newsletter, which you can do by going to mongabay.com, find the button that says newsletter in the upper right side of the page, and click on it. But you can follow us here on YouTube or on LinkedIn, where we're always broadcasting discussions like this. And lastly, follow us on social media. We're on Threads, Mastodon, Blue Sky, and LinkedIn, where we post announcements about our webinar offerings all the time. So thank you, everyone, for joining, and hopefully we'll see you again sometime in the future.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.
Thank you.